The email landed in my inbox at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, while I was still in my car in the hospital parking garage, eating a granola bar and dreading my shift. We've discussed this as a family and we all agree it's best if you step back from your role here. You've always been difficult. We think some distance will be good for everyone, Mom and Dad. My sister Adele had replied to the thread 6 minutes later. Just 3 words. Completely agree. Finally. I sat there with the granola bar halfway to my mouth, reading it twice, then a third time. Not because I didn't understand it. I understood it perfectly. I was sitting in it. The feeling you get when something you've been bracing for your whole life finally just happens. Like the moment a doctor stops talking around the diagnosis and just says the word. I'm a CPA. I work with numbers for a living. I understand ledgers. I understand what it means when a column of debt succeeds a column of credits and the account is no longer solvent. I finished the granola bar. Then I opened my laptop. My parents had always treated shared accounts and family finances like they were community property, which meant in practice that I was the community. When I was 24, I'd added myself to their cell phone plan because my father, Gerald, said it was a family discount and someone had to manage the billing. That was 11 years ago. The plan had grown from 3 lines to 5. I was still paying for all of them. The family Dropbox account. The one with every photo, every scanned document, every tax return Gerald refused to file properly, was under my email address. I'd set it up the same year I graduated college and made the mistake of telling my mother, Donna, that I was good with computers. I went to the account settings. I changed the email address attached to the account to one I'd made 3 years ago when I first realized I might need it someday. Then I changed the recovery number. Then the password. I sat back. In accounting, there's a term called reconciliation. It's the process of making sure 2 records match, what you think you have and what you actually have. Most people never reconcile their family relationships. They just carry forward whatever balance exists from childhood and call it love. I had been reconciling mine for years. The balance was not what anyone would call healthy. I opened the phone carrier app. I removed Gerald's line first, then Donna's. Then Adele's. I removed my brother Kevin's line last. Kevin, who had read the email and said nothing, which I decided was its own kind of answer. The disconnection would process at the end of the billing cycle in 22 days. They wouldn't know until they tried to use their phones and the data throttled down to nothing. A ticking clock, quiet as a stopped watch. I didn't call anyone. I didn't reply to the email. I walked into my shift at the firm, sat down at my desk, and spent the next 9 hours closing a Q3 audit for a client in Seattle. The messages started the next morning. Hannah. My mother's texts always began with my name like a sentence by itself. Something is wrong with the cloud photos. I can't get in. Then Gerald's voicemail, which I played on speaker while making coffee. I don't know what stunt you're pulling, but you need to fix it. We have documents in there. Personal things. Call me back before noon or I'm going to have to escalate this. Escalate it to whom? I thought. You've already fired me from the family. Adele texted me separately. What did you do to the Dropbox? Mom is freaking out. You're being so childish. Then, 20 minutes later, are you seriously not responding? This is exactly why no one wants to deal with you. I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter and ate my eggs. Here is what they had apparently forgotten. I was the one who filed their taxes. I was the one who caught the error in my parents' home refinancing in 2019 that would have cost them $14,000 if I hadn't flagged it. I was the one who spent 4 months helping Gerald dispute a wrongful judgment from a contractor who'd sued him and won by default because Gerald hadn't opened his mail. I was not a daughter to them. I was a service they'd been getting for free for a decade, and they'd cut the service while assuming the account would stay open. It wouldn't. But there was something else. Something I hadn't told anyone yet, not even my closest friend, not even in those 2 a.m. moments when I almost picked up the phone and said it out loud. My grandfather, my mother's father, a quiet man named Warren who'd spent 40 years running a small but very profitable commercial real estate business in Western Pennsylvania, had called me 3 weeks before the email arrived. His voice had been thinner than I remembered, tired in that specific way that isn't about sleep. I need to tell you something, he'd said. Before things get complicated. I hadn't known what he meant, now I did. Warren had been sick for months. He hadn't told the family, meaning he hadn't told Donna, who would have managed his illness like a personal affront and made his final months a campaign. He told me quietly, and he told his lawyer, a methodical woman named Patricia. Wait, no, I checked myself. I need to be precise about the names. He'd told his attorney, a woman named Judith Crane, who had been managing his affairs for over 20 years. He'd called to tell me that the will had been updated, that he wanted me to know because he said, and I have this on a voicemail I still haven't deleted, "You're the only one who ever asked me how I was doing without wanting something. I want you to be ready." I hadn't known what that meant either. I thought maybe he was leaving me something sentimental, a piece of furniture. His old watch. I found out what it meant on a Thursday morning in October, in a room that smelled like lemon polish and old carpet, in the conference room of Judith Crane's law office in Pittsburgh. But first I had to get through the war. Gerald's threats escalated on a Tuesday. He left a voicemail that was different from the others, slower, deliberate, the voice he used when he wanted to sound like someone who had options. "Hannah," he said, "I've spoken with a colleague who works in accounting compliance. If you don't restore those accounts and resume your contributions to this family by end of week, I'm going to contact the Pennsylvania State Board of Accountancy and report you for misappropriating client data. I have enough information to make your life very difficult. Think carefully." I played it twice. The first time I felt the old thing, the clench in the stomach, the reflex of someone who'd been taught from childhood that Gerald's displeasure had consequences. The second time I felt something else entirely, something cleaner. He had no information. He had never understood what I actually did at work. He used the word misappropriating the way people use medical terms they've only heard on television. But the threat was real enough to document. I called my own attorney that afternoon. I'd had one since I incorporated my freelance bookkeeping practice at 28, which Gerald had called pretentious at the time. I forwarded the voicemail. I wrote down the date, the time, the exact wording. I emailed it to myself with a timestamp. In accounting, you document everything, not because you're suspicious, because memory is not a reliable ledger. 3 days later, Judith Crane's office called. My grandfather had passed quietly that morning. He'd been at home. He'd apparently made sure everything was in order beforehand, which, I would come to learn, was very much like him. The will reading was scheduled for the following Thursday. My parents and Adele had already been notified. I want to be honest about what the next week felt like. I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't plotting. I was grieving, quietly, in the way I'd learned to grieve things in a family where emotions were either weaponized or ignored, which meant I mostly felt things alone, in the car, or on the treadmill at 5 a.m. Warren had been the only person in my family who treated me like I was already enough, and now he was gone, and I was about to walk into a room with the people who had emailed me to say I was no longer theirs. I chose my outfit carefully, not because I wanted to impress anyone, because I understood the audience. My mother had a particular way of looking at me when she wanted to signal to a room that I was unstable, a small, sad smile, a slight tilt of the head. The body language of someone bravely managing an embarrassing situation. She'd deployed it at holidays, at family dinners, in front of Gerald's work colleagues when I said something she hadn't pre-approved. I knew the performance. I'd watched it my whole life. If she was going to perform, I needed her to have material to work with, something that confirmed her narrative before things shifted. I wore a sweater I'd had since college. Grey, slightly pilled at the elbows, sleeves just a little long. I didn't do my hair. I wore the kind of earrings you'd wear if you'd grabbed them without thinking. I practiced in my bathroom mirror, the particular stillness of someone who has been crying and is trying to hold it together. Shoulders slightly in. Eyes down. Give them the version they expect. Let them feel certain. The conference room had a long oak table and windows that looked out onto a parking structure. Gerald and Donna were already seated when I arrived. Gerald in a sport coat he wore to things he considered important. Donna in a dark blouse with her posture like a woman expecting to receive something due to her. Adele was on her phone, her leg crossed over her knee, foot bouncing. She looked up when I came in and made a small sound that wasn't quite a greeting. I sat in the chair farthest from the door, pulled my sleeves down over my hands and looked at the table. "Oh, you came," my mother said, as if this were notable. I nodded. I didn't say anything. Judith Crane entered at exactly 10 o'clock. She was in her 60s, short grey hair, no performance about her. She sat down, opened a folder the size of a novel, and adjusted her reading glasses. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "Warren was specific about his wishes, so I'll move through this efficiently." Gerald leaned forward already. He had the posture of someone who had pre-decided he was about to receive good news. Judith read through the preliminary language, the asset summary. Warren's estate was not small. The commercial properties he'd managed and partially owned over 40 years had accrued. There was a building in downtown Pittsburgh, 2 strip parcels in the suburbs, a portfolio of REITs, and a savings account that had been quietly compounding since 1987. Judith named the total. The room changed. I watched my mother's hand move to Gerald's arm. Not out of grief, but out of the specific alertness of someone recalculating. I watched Adele's foot stop its bouncing. I kept my eyes mostly on the table, but I was watching all of it. "The entirety of Warren's estate," Judith said, looking up over her glasses, "is bequeathed to his granddaughter Hannah." Silence. Not the polite kind. The kind where several people are all deciding at the same time what to do with information they did not expect. Gerald moved first. "That's not right." His voice was controlled, the low, certain tone of a man who believes his certainty is evidence. "My father-in-law was in declining health. This needs to be reviewed." "Warren was assessed by his physician and found competent at the time of signing," Judith said. "The way someone reads a fact. The documentation is part of the record." "He was confused," Donna said. Her voice had a quality I recognized, a kind of smooth, reasonable distress, calibrated to sound credible to strangers. He hadn't been himself for months. "Hannah." She looked at me with the expression, the small, sad smile, the head tilt, took advantage of a vulnerable man. I let my chin tremble slightly. I looked at the table. "I think," Gerald said, "that given the circumstances, it would be appropriate for the family to assume oversight of this estate until a proper review can be conducted." He meant himself. He was already somewhere else in his mind. I could see it in the way he'd settled back slightly in his chair, the posture of a man touching the wall of something he believed was already his. "There is a provision," Judith said, without any particular inflection, "that is relevant here." She read it. Warren had included language that any heir or beneficiary who formally contested Hannah's receipt of the estate, on grounds of incompetence, undue influence, or any related claim, would forfeit any bequest made to them within the will. Gerald had been left $30,000 for, as Warren had written, old time's sake. Donna had been left her mother's jewelry collection. Adele had been left a small savings bond. Judith set the paper down. "If any of you choose to proceed with a formal challenge, those bequests would be voided." My father looked at my mother. Something passed between them that had the quality of a calculation being run very fast. "That clause," Gerald said slowly, "doesn't apply to a competency review. That's not a challenge to the will. That's a legal protection for the estate." Judith looked at him the way someone looks at a person who is saying something she has heard before. "The language covers any formal legal action taken against the terms of the will. A competency review filed by a beneficiary would be covered." "Hannah clearly cannot manage this," Donna said. She gestured toward me, toward the two-bead sweater, the unwashed hair, the trembling. "Look at her. She can barely hold herself together. She's never managed anything larger than a personal checking account. And here is the thing about performing for an audience that has decided in advance what they're seeing. They never notice when you stop." I set my hands flat on the table. I straightened my spine. I looked at my mother directly, probably for the first time in that room. "I'm a licensed CPA," I said. "I've been managing a 6-figure client portfolio for 4 years. I also have a voicemail from Gerald threatening to file a false report with the state licensing board, which I've already forwarded to my attorney. I'd be happy to discuss that separately." The silence had a different quality this time. Warren knew what he was doing. I said. He was meticulous. He planned this out over years. You know that you just don't want it to be true. Judith was watching me with an expression that was not quite neutral. Something quieter than approval. Recognition, maybe. Gerald's jaw moved. You manipulated him. I called him every Sunday for 15 years, I said. I drove to Pittsburgh when he had his knee surgery in 2021. I helped him review his lease agreements every spring because he trusted me with numbers and didn't want to pay Judith's hourly rate for routine checks. I paused. I didn't manipulate him. I just showed up. Donna opened her mouth. Gerald put his hand on her arm. Adele had not said anything since the total was announced. She was looking at her phone, but I could tell by the tension in her jaw that she wasn't reading anything. I want it noted, Gerald said to Judith, that we reserve the right to consult our own attorney. Of course, Judith said. The 30-day window for any formal filing begins today. They filed nothing. I know because Judith let me know 31 days later with a short email. No formal action has been filed. The estate transfer can proceed. That was it. 3 sentences. My phone carrier had disconnected their lines on the 22nd of the month, 8 days before the will reading. Donna had texted me from Adele's phone the week of the reading, one message, no context, "This is Mom. Please call me." I didn't. The Dropbox had locked them out permanently about a week after I'd changed the credentials. I know Donna had been using it to store scanned copies of documents she didn't trust to keep physically, insurance papers, the deed to their house, years of Gerald's business correspondence. I didn't delete any of it. I just moved it to an archive folder and left it there, inaccessible to them. Intact for whenever I decided what to do with it. I am not going to tell you this was easy. There's a specific grief in realizing that the people who were supposed to be your family were never really interested in who you were, only in what you could provide. I had spent 36 years adjusting myself around a set of people who treated my presence as a resource and my absence as a betrayal. I had paid for their phone lines and their cloud storage and their tax filings and their legal disputes. And I had done it because that was how I'd been taught love worked. That to be acceptable, you had to be useful. That the cost of belonging was silence and labor, and the quiet rearrangement of yourself to fit whatever the room required. Warren had never been like that. Warren had sat across from me at a diner table in Pittsburgh when I was 22 and asked me what I actually wanted to do with my life. Not what I was planning, not what would make my parents proud. What I wanted. And when I told him I liked numbers, that I liked the logic of them, that I wanted to run my own practice someday, he had just nodded and said, "Then do that." Not are you sure? Not what will your father think? Just do that. That diner is still there. I drove past it the week I took possession of the first property transfer. I didn't go in. I just sat in the parking lot for a few minutes. The estate transfer took 4 months in total. The properties, the accounts, the REITs. Judith walked me through every step with the patience of someone who has untangled complicated inheritances before and knows that grief and paperwork do not proceed on the same timeline. I learned more about commercial real estate in those 4 months than I'd known in my entire career. Warren had been meticulous in his record keeping. Every lease, every maintenance history, every tenant communication, filed and dated and cross-referenced. He had built something orderly and careful and real. He'd also left a letter. It was in a sealed envelope with my name on it, attached to the back of the will folder. Judith handed it to me after the meeting, after my family had left the room. She didn't say anything about it. She just handed it to me and went to refill her coffee. I didn't open it in the office. I opened it in my car. It was 3 paragraphs. His handwriting was smaller than I remembered, precise, tilted slightly. He wrote that he'd watched me for years, making myself smaller so the people around me could feel larger, and that it had bothered him more than he'd known how to say. He wrote that the money wasn't the point. The point was that he wanted me to have something that couldn't be argued with, something with legal weight, something that said in the clearest possible terms, "This belongs to her, and there is nothing you can do about it. You've always known what you were worth," he wrote at the end. I just wanted to make sure no one else could argue otherwise. I sat in the parking lot for a long time. I'm not going to tell you I forgave my family because I haven't, and I think the pressure women feel to arrive at forgiveness quickly is its own kind of trap. What I will tell you is that I stopped performing for them. I stopped managing their access to me, their impression of me, their narrative about me. The email they'd sent, "Some distance will be good for everyone," turned out to be the most useful thing they'd ever given me. I took the distance. I kept it. Donna texted twice in the months after the reading, both times from Adele's phone, both times without acknowledging anything that had happened. The first message asked if I had a copy of a document from the Dropbox she needed for Gerald's business license renewal. The second one just said Happy Thanksgiving, like none of it had happened, like she could smile at me from 3 months in the past and I would just absorb it. I didn't respond to either one. Gerald, I heard through my cousin, had been hit harder by the $30,000 forfeiture than he'd admitted. There had been a debt, not a modest one. The kind of debt that accumulates when someone spends years performing financial security rather than building it. The $30,000 had been, apparently, already promised to someone. The loss of it had consequences. I won't pretend that didn't feel like something. The building downtown, Warren's main commercial property, a 6-floor mixed use on Penn Avenue that had been fully leased for the last 11 years, needed a new management structure. I hired a property management firm, spent a weekend with their team going through Warren's systems and kept almost everything he'd built intact. There was nothing broken. He had just been running it himself because he liked to. And now he wasn't there to do that, so someone else would. I still drive out to Pittsburgh once a month. I walk the properties. I review the lease renewals. I eat at a different diner each time, trying to find one that has the same kind of coffee as the place Warren liked. I haven't found it yet. There's a photo of me tucked into the back of a drawer in Warren's old office, the room I've been slowly converting into my own working space. I'm maybe 11 in it at some family thing, in a dress I remember hating, squinting into the sun. Someone had written on the back in handwriting that isn't Warren's, "Hannah, always making that face." It was meant as a mild criticism. The kind of small thing someone says to a child that they don't think matters and that the child carries anyway for 25 years. I put it back in the drawer, not because I want to look at it, but because I'm not in that dress anymore and I'm not squinting, and the person who wrote that is no longer in charge of how I see myself. Some people wait their whole lives for their family to acknowledge what they've given. They keep the account open, keep making deposits, keep hoping the balance will eventually even out. It doesn't. It just keeps going until you close it. I closed it. If you're still holding the line open, still waiting for the call where they finally say it, you're allowed to hang up. You're allowed to change the number. You're allowed to build something new with what you have left and let the people who underestimated you sit with what that cost them. Don't wait for their permission. You never needed it. People ask me sometimes if I regret any of it. The locked Dropbox, the disconnected phone lines, walking into Judith's office in a fraying grey sweater with my chin trembling on purpose. And I always have to think about it for a second, not because I'm uncertain, but because the honest answer is more complicated than yes or no. What I regret is the time. Not what I did. The time. I regret is the 11 years I paid for their phone lines without once being asked if I was okay. I regret the 4 months of overtime I worked to wire $42,000 to save a house where I was never quite welcome. I regret every holiday dinner where I sat a little smaller, spoke a little quieter, rearranged myself in real time to avoid whatever version of conflict Gerald was building toward that day. That's the thing nobody tells you about families like mine. The damage isn't usually one big event, it's the accumulation. Years of small adjustments that teach you your instincts can't be trusted. That your needs are the problem. That love is something you earn by making yourself useful and then disappearing. Warren never asked me to disappear. That's what I keep coming back to. He was the one person in that family who looked at me and just waited. Like he had time. Like whatever I was about to say actually mattered to him. That's not a small thing. Most people go their whole lives without someone who looks at them that way, and I had it, and I didn't understand how rare it was until it was gone. The choices I made in the weeks after that email were not acts of revenge. I want to be clear about that because I think there's a version of this story that gets told as a revenge story, and that's not what it was. I didn't close the accounts to hurt them. I closed the accounts because I had finally, at 36 years old, reconciled the ledger. I looked at what I had been giving and what I had been receiving, and I understood, really understood, not just intellectually but in my body, that the exchange was not sustainable and had never been fair. So I stopped. Not out of anger, out of accuracy. There's something I've come to believe about the way cause and consequence actually works. Not in some cosmic sense, but in a very ordinary human one. The things we do to people tend to return to us in the form of the relationships we end up with. Gerald and Donna spent decades treating me like a resource. They trained Adele to see me as competition. They built a family culture where emotional honesty was weakness and financial dependency was leverage. And in the end, that's exactly what they were left with, people who only showed up when there was something to take. The waiver they signed wasn't a mistake. It was the logical endpoint of who they had always been. They saw money and they grabbed for it, and they lost the only thing that had been genuinely offered to them, a chance to be in my life. I am not a saint. I didn't handle every moment of this gracefully. There were nights in those 4 months of estate transfer where I sat in Warren's old office and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry in years. Not for the inheritance, but for the fact that it had taken a document with legal weight to finally make me feel like I was worth something to someone in that family. That's the part I carry. Not the money. The fact that it took a will. But I also know this. I showed up. Every Sunday for 15 years, I called a man who lived 4 hours away and asked him how he was doing. I drove to Pittsburgh when he needed a ride home from surgery. I sat with him over coffee and talked about lease agreements and interest rates and the Pirates' terrible season and whatever book he'd been reading. I did it because I loved him, and that is the only ledger that has ever really mattered to me. The accounts are closed. The lines are disconnected, and I go to Pittsburgh once a month and walk the properties Warren left me and drink bad diner coffee and feel, maybe for the first time, like I am exactly where I'm supposed to be. That's enough. It's more than enough. It always was.